last time our next guest was on the program, she was talking about getting rid of the copay in healthcare, and now she has a new piece out in Jacobin. Natalie Shure is the author of an article headlined, and I always put it that way because if you're a writer, you know, you don't always write your own headlines, but sometimes you do. The article is headlined, "The Feminist Case for Single Payer." And I thought it was great, so I asked her back, and she said, okay. So, Natalie, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let me ask you, first of all, one of the things that I loved about this article was you lead off by talking about the birth of modern feminism in the late 60s. And you made a connection that I had never made, which was the groundedness of early feminism in issues of health and the female body. There was a very best-selling book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which you mentioned. There was a strong critique of capitalism and its ability to deliver adequate health to women or lack thereof. Because one of the things that's always been alienating to me about the conversation around healthcare of late has been the disconnectedness that I think some people maybe even encourage between movements like feminism and their relationship with issues like healthcare for everyone. Does that make sense to you, what I just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly significant intersections between feminism and healthcare. I think as they exist in modern parlance, I think that the reproductive rights discussions are probably the best example. But I was really fascinated to find out that in the late 1960s, this feminist collective in Boston that put together the project that ended up being the magnanimously best-selling Our Bodies, Ourselves, they really did make that connection very explicitly. And they connected their sense of alienation and their disconnectedness from their own bodies to, capitalism and the way that it commodified women's bodies and women's care within the context that it existed. So I found it interesting that that discussion has really gotten away from us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it's very resonant for me, and where it goes for me is generally the notion that the female body, if it is we know it's objectified and exploited, but the multiplicity of forms that exploitation takes includes the way that healthcare is delivered to women, the way that women are shortchanged in the healthcare system. We've seen it time and time again in the healthcare debate. So it seems to me that by connecting the two, as you've done, by making a feminist case for single payer, you're strengthening both sides of the equation, the single payer argument and feminism. You agree with that?
Well, and I would actually add even more to that. To me, so essentially the argument for single payer from a feminist standpoint is based on a few things. One, the fact that in the United States, our basic needs are very, very privatized. And that includes healthcare, of course, but that also includes things that women are traditionally responsible for in their families, like elder care, child care, different domestic responsibilities that are completely unpaid and happen outside of wage labor. Meanwhile, wage labor or our employment tends to be, is still the main way that we get health insurance. So that's how we can access the healthcare system. There are options outside of it, but those tend to be the dominant ones and those tend to be the best. And so you have a situation wherein women are in a bind that to access health insurance, the go-to method is to have a 40-hour-a-week job. It's not even all jobs. It's a very specific type of employment. And that squeezes women because if you have to work 40 hours a week to get your health care, like in a lot of contexts, you have pretty limited options when it comes to other care responsibilities that people need to perform to keep society humming along, to make sure that people get to their jobs. You have to be have some provision for people to take care of people who can't work, and that those are completely privatized. So women are just very, very bilked and pulled from all sides by the fact that we privatize most of our basic needs and the fact that we specifically confer access to them through employment.
Yeah, well, I think the employment access is a critical piece of it. You mentioned the family access too, in a sense that the spouse may be, if not a prerequisite healthcare coverage, in some cases can be that if the spouse is the only one with full-time employment and so on, so that healthcare becomes not an individual right, but something that can only be accessed through our relationships with others, and more often than not, male-dominated others. Is there a way to turn this into, I think in a sense that's what you were doing in your piece, but is there a way to turn this into a holistic argument for single payer?
Yeah, I think that for me, it was really important to, take some different arguments that are made about women's rights and about healthcare in general and try to synthesize them. You brought up the idea that a lot of women are insured through their male partners, and that's absolutely true. And that was such a critical point for me because one thing that single-payer advocates point to, or at least people who are critical of our employment-based system point to, is this phenomenon called job lock, which is the idea that in our current system, people are often really stuck in jobs that they can't stand, and it's difficult to leave to pursue something else, to freelance, to do anything along those lines, especially to seek, flexible employment arrangements that disproportionately fall to women because of their other care roles, that those things can be particularly difficult in our current context because people need health insurance, right? That really just ties people to their jobs in a way that it doesn't in other countries. And so if that's true, there's so much discussion about that, it's also obviously very true that, people can get stuck in jobs because of our employment-based healthcare system, then that also applies to relationships. And if you get health insurance specifically through your marriage, through your relationship to a salaried worker who has benefits, then that you can see why that would trap a lot of women in relationships that they don't want to be in, or at least reduce their power within those relationships because they need to receive health insurance for them and potentially their children.
I think this is such a fantastic point and such a fantastically important point that I really want to, congratulate you for making it. Really want to encourage you to keep making it. You also point out in your piece for Jacobin that there have been in recent years feminist arguments framed against single payer. You mentioned, for example, Planned Parenthood of California's refusal to endorse the California bill for a statewide single-payer system, and the argument that it was critical to focus on defending the Affordable Care Act instead. For one thing, that argument just in general never made sense to me because I've never believed that political debates are advanced through defense. I'm of the school that in a situation like this, the best defense is always a good offense anyway. But also, clearly, the Affordable Care Act, the reason why it doesn't have more traction politically and more support politically is because it's dependent on the private sector healthcare system and because it assumes in its very structure, if you really look into the mechanics of it and the exchanges and so on, it was really crafted with the assumption that most Americans would continue to get their health care through employers, that this was almost an exception management system. That's the way I see it. I don't know if you agree with that, but if you say, well, the real feminist position here is that healthcare should not be dependent on employment, it should not be dependent on spouse's employment, then you're also saying we need to move beyond the Affordable Care Act to Medicare for all, single payer. whatever you call it. So, are you saying really that these feminist defenses, this argument, for example, that Planned Parenthood of California made, is actually harmful in the long run?
Yeah, I think that the argument that, it's not the time to push for single payer, it's the time to protect the ACA, I think that that's a very emotional argument. And, of course, it's very important. I think all single payer advocates would agree to defend the ACA against whatever the GOP would replace it with, which is basically a kick me sign on your back and, shoving you into a boiling pot of lava.
Right.
There's definitely a huge reason to keep the ACA to, defend the advances that it has made, and it has made a lot of people, or it has helped a lot of people based on what came before, compared to what came before it. But I also think that the idea that it's not time to advance a robust counterargument is really a misguided one. It also doesn't bear out historically. When we saw the enaction of Medicare in 1965, that was actually on the heels of several years of something called the Kerr-Mills Act, which was structurally a lot more similar to the ACA. It had, a means tested for the very, very poor elderly people. It had help available for them. It is administered by state. It offered some tax credits to give them some relief buying public insurance. And, I think that having that program in place really got people to see that, hey, this structure isn't worth defending. We're not going to get where we need to get based on this system, and that then they pushed further and then got Medicare. I think that, if anything, I think that the ACA is obviously presenting its own shortcomings, and that, telling people, look, this thing are good. What we need is more. And that does disproportionately assist women, not just because of the employment issues, but because in a privatized, commodified healthcare system, we also pay disproportionately more for our care. Maternity care is one of the most common reasons for hospitalization, and women tend to need a lot of routine care just because they use more care in their reproductive years, especially, and that costs so much more. And the ACA pushed back against some of that by saying that people can't be charged based on pre-existing conditions or based on health differences, which would include a lot of reproductive issues. I think that it's still very obvious to me that even given all of that, single payer is the more robust system to push for. And, this goes beyond just a couple months of, this is the budget reconciliation period and we need to defend we need to defend the ACA right now. I mean, movements for these things take a long time, and we really need to, start inoculating ourselves against counterpunches from the right.
Well, absolutely. And I also feel I'm a huge believer that movements and political change happen and gain strength when you articulate a vision of a better world. And to me, that's one of the reasons I think why I resonated with your piece so much. If we can explain to people that of course, sure, we want to defend the ACA for the things it does, but we have a vision of a world where you don't have to go through what you go through today. Not only are we going to prevent it from getting worse, or do our best to prevent it, but we see an achievable world, a world that already exists in 35 other developed countries or whatever. We see a world where your autonomy as a human being, as a woman, is strengthened because healthcare is no longer shackling you to situations you may not want to be in. That is part, to me, of articulating the vision of a better society that's going to draw people to your movement, to your party, whatever it may be. Then you're in a better position to do the defensive stuff while you're building for a better future. I'm sorry, I've gone on a little long there, but
that's a perfect point. And beyond that, I think that it's good politics. I mean, yeah, it articulates a counter vision, and it also creates a constituency of people who are very defensive of these programs, who have benefited from them more. When we did see Republican efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, I think that most people would agree that the most robust protections of the ACA and some of the most powerful fighters against the Republican plans weren't people defending the exchanges or the individual mandate. They were people defending the Medicaid expansion, people from groups like National Adapt, a disabilities rights organization, that were very passionately defending the way that their lives had been transformed by this law, by this, Medicaid expansion law. And, it's very easy to imagine why people would be more passionate about protecting a program like Medicare for All, which would benefit a whole lot of people, compared to, okay, it's, Saturday again, it's time to, defend the market regulations in the ACA again. It's a completely different calculus that has a different meaning in individual lives.
Yeah, you notice that in the first year in office, Trump and his fellow Republicans didn't try to dismantle Medicare, did they? So I think that's a great point. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but Natalie, where can people go to read more of your stuff, or particularly the feminist case for single payer?
Sure. That was on Jacobin, in Jacobin Magazine. You can also look at my website, is natalieshure.com, or on Twitter at Natalie Shurley, Surely.
Well, thank you for that. And Natalie Shure, thanks for writing this great piece, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.